Ever looked up at the night sky, seen the moon, or maybe caught a glimpse of Mars and wondered what the future holds for us out there? We dream of colonies, scientific breakthroughs, and a new frontier for humanity. But with every new frontier in human history, from the Old West to the high seas, there's been conflict. So the big question is, could we see a war on the moon or even Mars? It sounds like science fiction, but the reality is more complex than you might think. Let's start with what we have right now. The foundational rule for space is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Over 100 countries, including the United States, Russia, and China, have signed it. This treaty is pretty idealistic. It says space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is the province of all mankind. It explicitly bans placing nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. It also states that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. No military bases, no weapons testing, no military maneuvers. Sounds great, right? Problem solved? Not quite. The treaty was written during the Cold War. The main goal was to prevent the US and the Soviet Union from turning the moon into a nuclear missile launch pad. But the authors in the 1960s couldn't have predicted the world we live in today. They weren't thinking about private companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin, or the incredible value of resources like helium-3, a potential fuel for clean nuclear fusion, or the vast amounts of water ice trapped in lunar craters, which can be turned into rocket fuel. This is where things get tricky. The treaty says no country can claim sovereignty over any part of space. You can't plant a flag on the moon and say, "This crater is mine." But it's a bit fuzzy on resource extraction. Can a country or a private company go to the moon, mine a bunch of valuable stuff, and claim ownership of that? This is a huge gray area. The 1979 Moon Agreement tried to clarify this, stating that celestial resources are the common heritage of mankind, and that an international regime should be set up to govern their exploitation. But guess what? The major spacefaring nations, the US, Russia, and China, never signed it. They wanted to keep their options open. Fast forward to today, and we have things like the Artemis Accords, a US-led initiative. These accords set up principles for cooperation in the civil exploration and use of the moon, Mars, comets, and asteroids. One of the key principles is about space resources. The accords state that the extraction and use of space resources should be done in a way that complies with the Outer Space Treaty. It essentially supports the idea that you can own the resources you extract. Naturally, countries like Russia and China see this as an attempt by the US to bypass the UN and write its own rules for space, creating a sort of pact of the willing that benefits its allies and commercial partners. So, you can see the battle lines being drawn. It's a clash of philosophies. On one side, you have the common heritage idea, where space belongs to everyone and should be managed globally. On the other, you have the first-come, first-served approach, where those with the technology and capital to get there first can reap the rewards. Now, let's talk about why someone would even want to fight over a dusty rock hundreds of thousands of miles away. The answer, as always, is resources and strategic advantage. Let's start with the moon. Lunar water ice, concentrated at the poles, is liquid gold in space. You can drink it, you can get oxygen from it to breathe, and you can split it into hydrogen and oxygen to make rocket fuel. A base on the moon with access to water could become the galaxy's gas station. Any nation or company that controls this resource controls access to the rest of the solar system. Imagine being able to refuel your Mars-bound ships at the moon. It would be a massive economic and strategic advantage. Then there's helium-3, which I mentioned earlier. It's rare on Earth, but thought to be abundant in lunar soil, deposited by solar winds over billions of years. If we crack fusion power, helium-3 could be an incredibly valuable energy source. Controlling the galaxy's primary supply of clean energy fuel, that's a prize worth fighting for. Beyond resources, There's the military angle. The Outer Space Treaty bans WMDs, but it's much quieter on conventional weapons. What about a kinetic bombardment weapon, a rod from God launched from the moon? It wouldn't be a WMD, but it could strike anywhere on Earth with devastating force. Or what about surveillance? A base on the moon provides a stable, untouchable perch to monitor the entire planet. Communications and navigation systems on Earth could be targeted from a lunar outpost. The nation that controls the lunar high ground could hold the ultimate strategic advantage. The situation on Mars is similar, just on a grander scale and a longer timeline. Mars has its own resources, including vast amounts of water ice and minerals. The first nation to establish a self-sustaining colony on Mars would achieve a level of prestige and power unparalleled in human history. It would be the ultimate backup for humanity, a second cradle of civilization. But imagine two competing colonies from rival nations on Mars. What happens when they have a border dispute over a newly discovered ice deposit? There are no police, no courts, no UN peacekeepers on Mars. Disputes would have to be settled by the colonists themselves, and if their home nations are rivals, things could escalate quickly. So, what would a war in space actually look like? Forget dogfights with laser cannons like in Star Wars. A real space war would be much scarier and probably much quieter. It would be a war of technology and sabotage. You wouldn't need to blow up a rival's lunar base. You could just disable their power grid with a high-energy laser or blind their sensors. You could use a robotic rover to accidentally crash into their mining equipment. A cyber attack could cripple life support systems, which would be a death sentence. The distances and harsh environment make traditional warfare almost impossible. A single stray bullet could puncture a habitat, leading to explosive decompression. Supply lines from Earth would be incredibly long and vulnerable. A conflict on the Moon or Mars would be a slow, tense, and deadly chess game, fought with robots, AI, and cyber warfare. The goal wouldn't be to occupy territory in the traditional sense, but to deny the enemy access to resources and cripple their ability to operate. And the consequences would be catastrophic. A conflict in space could create a massive amount of debris. This is known as the Kessler syndrome. One collision creates debris, which causes more collisions, creating even more debris, until low Earth orbit, or even cislunar space, the space between Earth and the Moon, becomes an impassable minefield of high-velocity junk. This would trap us on Earth for generations, cutting off our access to satellites for GPS, communication, and weather forecasting. It would be a self-imposed prison, ending our spacefaring dreams before they've truly begun. So, are we doomed to repeat our earthly mistakes on other worlds? Not necessarily. The very danger of space conflict might be its greatest deterrent. The cost of entry is so high, and the risks are so immense, that cooperation might be the only logical choice. International projects like the International Space Station have shown that even rival nations can work together successfully in space. The enormous cost and technical challenge of building a Moon or Mars base will likely require international collaboration. Ultimately, the future of space depends on the choices we make today. We need to update and strengthen international space law for the 21st century. We need clear, enforceable rules for resource extraction and a system for resolving disputes before they escalate. We need to foster a culture of cooperation, not competition. The heavens don't have to become the next battlefield. The Moon and Mars can be symbols of what humanity can achieve when we work together. Beacons of hope, science, and exploration. But it's up to us to ensure that when we look up at those celestial bodies, we see a future of opportunity, not a reflection of our oldest conflicts. The choice is ours to make. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the future of science and technology.